and thank you, Fernando. Good morning from Canada. It's one of those times when we can actually say good morning to one another because it's pretty early here. It's my privilege to share our experience in the growth of pharmacy practice in Canada, and most specifically within our own province, Alberta, and some of the economic changes that have occurred because of that. I'm going to share with you my insight to our new services and financing models. I want to emphasize that I am the registrar of the college, which is the regulatory body for pharmacy in Alberta. However, my experience comes from prior to 2000, when I was registrar of the Alberta Pharmaceutical Association and had responsibilities both for regulatory affairs as well as economic affairs. And it's during that period where we began to develop our scope of practice, which eventually came into fruition in 2007. And by that time, we had two organizations, the college being the regulator and the association being the professional advocacy body. I want to emphasize that any success that we've enjoyed in Alberta is due to strong collaboration and cooperation between our college, the Alberta Pharmacists Association, and the Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Alberta. If it was not for my relationship with the dean of the faculty of the day, sometimes I wonder whether we actually would have achieved what we did. So with that, I'd like to begin sharing my screen and proceed with the presentation. Just bear with me 1 minute here. So welcome to Alberta. Oh. There we go. Welcome to Alberta. This is Canada. This is where Alberta is located. And we are a province that has a population today of about 4.4 million. We have about 1,470 pharmacies as of December last year, about 5,800 pharmacists and just over 1,600 pharmacy technicians. The economy of our province is based on agriculture, forestry, tourism, and we are the oil capital of Canada. So as we all struggle with COVID, similarly, our province is struggling economically because of a movement to greener energy, lower oil prices, and the global economic form around the oil sector. So we are going through significant change as a province, culturally and economically. In Canada, the delivery of healthcare is a provincial responsibility. However, the manner in which healthcare is delivered is defined by the 5 principles of the Canada Health Act. Those being that it is publicly administered, there needs to be accessibility, comprehensive care, universality, and portability. And the federal government provides transfer payments to the provinces to support the delivery of care. Those transfer payments are based on the economic position of provinces, as well as the size of their populations. So historically, Alberta has been a province of wealth, and therefore we have contributed more in taxes to the federal government than we have received in federal transfer payments. But nonetheless, again, we've been very, very fortunate with respect to the quality of the health system that we have. And certainly I believe that's enabled some of the growth and the innovation that we've seen in pharmacy practice. Again, coming back to the principles, I want to emphasize that with respect to drug therapy, the Canada Health Act requires that drugs that are provided in hospitals must be paid for by the governments. They're publicly funded, they're paid from the public system. As we move into the community, drugs may be paid for in one of 3 ways. Depending on the individual, it may be paid for publicly, Alternatively, it may be paid through private insurance, or there's individuals who don't qualify for the public programs and don't have private insurance, and therefore they are paying out of pocket. Individuals that receive coverage for drugs from the provincial government are typically seniors and those in lower income classes and disability classes. Those receiving private insurance are more commonly individuals that are insured through their employers and so forth. I emphasize that the delivery of healthcare is a provincial responsibility rather than a federal responsibility. And so therefore, health professions like pharmacy are regulated provincially, and therefore the scope of practice for pharmacists in each of the provinces across Canada are negotiated separately. And you'll see through my presentation that indeed the scope of practice that we have in Alberta certainly is the broadest in Canada and likely amongst the broadest across the world as of 2007. Again, because care is delivered provincially and is responsibility of the provincial government, all of the legislation affecting healthcare differs between the provinces. In the world of pharmacy, the responsibility of the federal government is very much related to drug product licensing. So if we use COVID as an example and we look at the advent of COVID vaccines, those are going to have to be reviewed and approved federally before they can be distributed and used within the pan-Canadian landscape. And again, I mentioned that pharmacy services are reimbursed differently between different provinces. So while I've suggested that drugs may be paid for by the public purse, privately, through private insurance, or by individuals, those schemes and how they're delivered and what they look like differ very much between provinces. And most of my presentation, again, is going to focus on Alberta. Just a little bit about the pharmacist scope of practice in Alberta. We went through substantive change in the late 1990s when our provincial premier established a process called health workforce rebalancing. And he was concerned that as we were looking to the future, that there was going to be a shortage of health professionals based on the growth of the province and the aging of the Alberta population. And during that time, we moved to omnibus legislation that governs all of the regulated health professions. And we moved away from a world of exclusive scopes of practice where pharmacists had exclusivity over dispensing drugs and selling drugs, and physicians had exclusivity over things like prescribing drugs, and nurses were heavily involved in doing injections. We moved to a new landscape where there were overlapping scopes of practice. So today, we, along with many other professions within Alberta, are privileged to be able to prescribe drugs, but equally so, as times change, there's others that are able to dispense drugs in the context of their scope of practice. Pharmacists were granted authority to prescribe drugs and administer drugs by injection in 2007. The prescribing model is a little bit complex. All pharmacists are able to adapt prescriptions. And what this means is that if a prescription is prescribed by another health professional, that the pharmacist has a responsibility to review it, to assess the patient, and determine whether that in fact is the appropriate medication for the individual. And adapting means that they can change the dose, they can change the dosage form. On the original prescription, they in fact could therapeutically substitute the drug. Pharmacists who have received approval for what we call additional prescribing privileges have the broadest scope with respect to prescribing. These are the individuals who can prescribe drugs at the first point of access. They're the individuals who are extremely active in managing chronic diseases. They're able to initiate new therapies, stop therapies, to change therapies. It's really broad in scope. The backbone of this is based on collaboration with other health professionals. The goal is to achieve appropriate drug therapy and to make sure that individuals are in fact receiving the right drugs for the right conditions in the right quantities. It's not about putting the right drug in the right bottle, which is the culture that we tried moving away from in the late 90s and early 2000s. Injection include the administration of drugs and vaccines, as well as immunizations. And if we look at this path over the course of the past 13 years, the first time that pharmacists in Alberta were reimbursed publicly for performing an immunization was in 2009 with the H1N1 outbreak. And I was just informed today that if we look to the current influenza campaign, that pharmacists in Alberta have already performed over 1 million immunizations in the course of the past month and a half. The first public funding for patient care, that is related to assessing, developing care plans, and performing functions outside of dispensing, was negotiated in 2012. This particular chart provides you a little bit of insight to the landscape of the scope of practice of pharmacists across Canada. If you look down the left-hand column where it says scope of practice, you can see the abbreviation for the 10 Alberta provinces and the 3 territories. Alberta is cited at the very top. I'm going to refer you to the URL at the very bottom of the slide, because this is one chart out of a 3 or 4 page document. And I was not able to include the kind of the agenda on the side here to give you an indication to what all of these symbols mean. But if we look to Alberta in the top left-hand side, if you go down the first gray column, you'll note that Alberta is the only province within which pharmacists have the authority to initiate a prescription very, very broadly. If you move to the second column, you see that there are more provinces where pharmacists are able to initiate a prescription, but the degree of collaboration that they require with another health professional usually requires a formal agreement in order to do that. And sometimes that creates barriers because of a lack of impetus or incentive by partnering health professionals to enter into those types of agreements. The third column reflects those provinces where there might be some type of prescribing that occurs as a result of delegation of authority from another health professional. But again, the extent to which any pharmacist performs these functions is highly dependent on those other health professionals. And as we move across this particular chart, we get into the purple area in the middle of the chart where we talk about prescribing when there is an existing prescription. You can see that that is now quite prevalent in all of the provinces. And then the teal colored column near the right-hand side of the chart talks about administering drugs through various routes, including injection. And as you can see, in most provinces now, pharmacists are at least performing immunizations. And as we move into the last columns, you can see that there's an increased evolution of pharmacists being able to order laboratory tests and to interpret laboratory tests. We in Alberta have been leading the charge in that particular file because when we negotiated the right for pharmacists to prescribe drugs, we argued with government that we were not able to perform that function well unless we were able to order laboratory tests and have access to laboratory information to assist us in patient care and in decision-making. And as time has gone on, that has become increasingly apparent in other provinces. We are now about 3 years out since we approved standards of practice for the ordering of laboratory tests and for the performance of point of care testing. And we feel very fortunate that we did that because as COVID came around, it positioned pharmacists in Alberta very well to be involved in asymptomatic testing. We were the first province in Canada where pharmacists were involved in asymptomatic testing. In weeks later, the province of Ontario invited pharmacists to participate in that. And as we move through weeks forthcoming, we expect that the scope of pharmacists and the role of pharmacists in testing with respect to COVID is probably going to escalate even more. I'd just like to talk a little bit about negotiating reimbursement for pharmacy service in Alberta. This is conducted by the Alberta Pharmacists Association, not by our college. I provided the URL to their website should you wish to get any further information about the association or how to contact them. They negotiate publicly funded services with Alberta Health and its administrator, Alberta Blue Cross. Typically, they negotiate fees for both services, the types of service that will be covered, and the fees that go along with them. And those include both patient care fees and drug distribution fees. Patient care fees are eligible for services provided to all Albertans. So the provincial government will reimburse pharmacists for care that is focused on patient care, but they will only pay for the drug distribution fees or the dispensing fees for those cohorts where publicly funding is available. And again, I referred to seniors and some of the lower socioeconomic classes, including individuals with disabilities. The provincial government did this because they saw value or potential value in the pharmacists being more involved in patient care. And they recognized that if pharmacists were going to be involved in prescribing drugs, the nature of engagement with patients was going to be different than when they're involved in the dispensing of drugs that have been prescribed by somebody else. There's a different type of responsibility that you take on, and therefore the importance of the patient relationships and the assessment goes along with it. Drug coverage in Alberta is based on a drug benefit list, which is again based on maximum acquisition cost. This is something that has been evolving over the course of the past 5 years, increasingly in every province across Canada. And we're finding now that the provinces are starting to work together so that certain molecules do have a maximum acquisition cost that is more pan-Canadian inclined. This has had a ripple effect across the pharmaceutical industry because one of the largest issues that pharmacists and patients are dealing with in Canada today are shortages of drugs, simply because we do not have access to a broad spectrum of manufacturers producing certain molecules. I've also provided you a copy to the URL with the Alberta government, which provides you a very comprehensive insight to the pharmacy services and the fee structure. Again, privately funded services are not negotiated by the association. Most private insurers recognize the fee structure that has been approved by the provincial government. However, in recent years, we have seen some private insurance companies move more to a preferred provider scheme where they are encouraging their clients to use certain pharmacies for their services. And there is one major national insurer who refers their clients to a mail order pharmacy located in the province of British Columbia. And that's certainly drawn the ire and concern of pharmacists of Alberta. And I think just like countries in Europe, I know certainly the United Kingdom, I can't speak for Portugal, but everybody is weary about the advent of Amazon and what the impact of that will have on drug distribution and where services are accessed. This chart provides you insight to the scheme that has been negotiated in Alberta. Again, this has generally been available since about 2012. The fees that are identified here are in Canadian dollars, so I just invite you to translate those for your purposes into euros, or should you be from Brazil, into the Brazilian currency. What I'd like to focus on here are the themes that talk about comprehensive annual care plan, standard medication management assessment, and annual care follow-up. This model was adopted from a model that was approved for the profession of medicine. So it's very similar to a scheme that was introduced for medicine in about 2010. And it was recognition or belief by the provincial government that there was value in conducting a comprehensive annual care plan for individuals who had chronic diseases or had certain lifestyle or personal conditions that were susceptible to a need for drug intervention. And these were individuals that typically had high drug costs associated with them. So the concept of a comprehensive annual care plan was introduced, and the fee that was provided for that is $100 per plan. And this indeed is an annual plan for any patient that qualifies for it. And then there were subsequent fees that were allowed for follow-up and monitoring of that plan. These fees are separate and distinct from the fee that the pharmacist would receive for dispensing. And certainly as you deal with things like medication management assessment and moving downwards, they do get a fee for the assessment that goes along with prescribing a drug for the patient. But what's important here is the concept of focusing on the patient care, focusing on the care plan, the monitoring of the patient, and the behaviors that go along with that. And I have to admit that after 13 years experience with the new scope of practice and with about 8 years experience with this general fee structure, we are still struggling with the cultural shift amongst pharmacy practitioners to get them to build the personal relationships that are necessary with patients. We're still on a slow growth curve in trying to get the engagement that is necessary for the appropriate assessments to make the informed decisions. And quite frankly, we have not seen the uptake that we would desire with the comprehensive annual care plans. There are many, many, many Albertans out there that qualify for these, that pharmacists have just not offered these to them yet. And as we sit here in 2020, the majority of income that still comes to pharmacies is through the dispensing process. This particular slide refers you to two charts. The first one is a report from the Canadian Foundation for Pharmacy, which outlines the professional service fees and claims data for government-sponsored pharmacy services by province up to 2020. So if you go to this URL, it'll provide you insight to the models that exist in each of the provinces across Canada. But again, I will submit that there's none of them that focus on the patient care element that I've just described in Alberta. The second URL refers you to changes in the provision of services and fee structures that have occurred with the advent of COVID. So again, in the case of Alberta, as an example, there was a new fee that was introduced to support pharmacists in performing asymptomatic COVID testing. And so that concludes my presentation. It provides a little bit of insight to the landscape of Canada with a focus of Alberta, the journey that we've been on. If I was to share any learning with you, my first point would be that I would never underestimate the effort that is required to create cultural change, to move pharmacy from a distribution profession to a patient care profession. I think that that's an effort that we are going to be undertaking over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. However, I believe that it is increasingly important with the advent of technology, with the advent of virtual care, and with the advent of centralized processing solutions like Amazon might offer. Unless pharmacists can ensure a very succinct patient relationship and can commit to dealing with the unique drug therapy needs of each patient through the relationships and the assessments that are necessary prior to making drug decisions, then I think that pharmacy is in a downhill spiral. The second thing that I'd emphasize, and I've mentioned it, is the shift from focusing on the drug to focusing on the patient. And the most important function of the pharmacist in the patient care world is about assessment. It's about asking the right questions. It's about inquiring. It's very much about listening. It's about understanding what the patient's needs are, what the patient's priorities are, so that in fact we can work with them and involve them in the decision-making about their drug therapy. And that's where our new opportunity lies, in developing relationships, confidence, and ensuring that any trust that we've had historically continues into the future and that we're not replaced with technical solutions. Thank you, everybody.